The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Hello, Habit Podcast listeners. Jonathan Rogers here. I just wanted to let you know about a new online class that starts October 13th. In Writing with Feechies, I'll walk writers through my novel, The Bark of the Bog Owl, with the goal of sharing some of the practical things I learned from writing my first book. It promises to be the swampiest writing course you've ever taken. Find out more at thehabit.co/bogowl. That's thehabit.co/BOGOWL. Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Russell Moore is a national treasure. He wades into the insanity of public discourse and speaks with good sense, clear logic, generosity, and courage. He's president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's also the author of several books, including a brand new one titled The Courage to Stand, Facing Your Fear Without Losing Your Soul. Talking to Russell Moore makes me feel a little more courageous. Russell Moore, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I am really excited about your book. That's by the time this podcast releases, your book will have released, The Courage to Stand, and the subtitle, Facing Your Fear Without Losing Your Soul. I want to start with that subtitle because it seems to imply that facing your fear, when you face your fear, there's a risk of losing your soul, which of course depends on how you face your fear.
Yeah.
So can you tell me more about that? I mean, what's the risk in facing your fear? That sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, I think the risk is trying to find a way to evade fear in ways that ultimately whittle away the conscience and whittle away who you actually are. And so I think there are some people who, when they come into contact with fear, sort of immediately lean into the limbic system and into a sense of fighting and outrage and so forth. And I think some of that has to do with when you find somebody who is unusually quarrelsome and is always in the middle of a conflict. I think there's a tendency to think, well, this is a fearless person, when we know that's not at all the case. This is usually somebody who is more fearful than someone else. Yeah. But the adrenaline is the way to address it, and not just the fear of what's going on the outside. I think a lot of that has to do with Walker Percy talks about in Moviegoer Binks Bowling going into the library and reading the conservative and liberal political magazines, not because he had any political viewpoint of his own, but because the fight between them gave him some sense of life, that hatred meant life.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of people, that sense of fighting or arguing or perpetual outrage is almost an approximation of life for a short period of time, sort of the lightning into the decaying flesh monster for a while, but it can't be sustained. Mm-hmm. And then I think other people simply move into a kind of avoidance, and I want to get through life distracting myself, as Blaise Pascal would talk about, just distracting myself from whatever it is that I'm fearful of, in a way that also is deadening and maddening. And so I think there are a lot of risks involved with how we choose to process fear. We don't get to choose whether or not we have fear, and we don't ultimately get to choose whether or not we'll face it, but we do get to choose how we do so.
Yeah. This is a podcast, of course, about writing for writers. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to reduce your, thesis about fear, strictly to the kinds of fear that writers face. But I do want to talk about it at least a little bit. And I know that your book has this jumping off place, the story of Elijah.
Yeah.
After he's faced down the prophets and he's, feeling lonely and vulnerable and irrelevant, which sounds kind of like just a regular day for a writer,
Yeah.
And I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think it in some ways sounds like a regular day for a writer, but I think a lot of writers assume that that's something to be transcended. And the vulnerability and the loneliness and the sense of irrelevance, that's something that I have to get around. And that's one of the reasons why I think fear is something that keeps us either from writing. I find myself when I'm unable to write for long periods of time, and I'm just I'm in that stage right now where I'm supposed to be working on something, but it's not here yet, and I find myself. I spent I don't know how many hours over the summer culling my library and getting rid of books that I don't need anymore. And I realized that was really not about making room as much as it was trying to find a relatively mindless task that I could achieve. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a sense of having a view of oneself in light of either comparing oneself to someone else or to what you think your audience is going to receive. All those fears are what ultimately either keep you from writing or cause you to write something other than what it is you actually want to say.
Yeah.
I faced that just recently with recording the audiobook for this book, because I found myself, it was an excruciating process because every sentence I would read, I would want to rethink. And
you should try reading your audiobook that you wrote 10 years ago.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
That was really painful.
Yeah.
And I kept seeing things that I've been teaching writers to do in the meantime that I didn't, that actually just didn't even know when I wrote, the novels that I read the audiobooks for. Yeah. And just cringed in some places. Anyway, sorry. I didn't mean to make this about my audiobooks. I'm excited about your audio. I'm so glad to hear that you're reading your own audiobook.
Well, the reason I am is because my wife insisted on it, because she had so many people who would listen to other audiobooks where there would be someone with a Minnesota accent, talking about growing up in South Mississippi or something.
Yeah, right.
Something like that. It's just too bizarre. Why don't you read it? But I don't know that I'm going to do it again.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you were headed down an idea that I don't think you finished talking about, and that is, you said we have it in our heads. We have to get over the vulnerability and the loneliness and the feelings of irrelevance. And I think you're heading someplace interesting that I'm not sure you got there yet. So I'm trying to put you back on that.
Well, I think if you look at the way, for instance, in the Elijah narrative, what God is saying repeatedly to Elijah is, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And at the end of it, what the reader realizes is that God was doing in that wilderness experience, that response to fear, he was doing for Elijah exactly what Elijah had been doing on Mount Carmel when he had this moment of what we would all long to have. I speak the word and fire falls from heaven, and I'm vindicated in front of.
That's what we're all shooting for when we write.
Yes, I'm vindicated in front of everybody. But that would be a dangerous place for anyone to be. That had to be removed from him. And so I'm struck by how often in Scripture fear is revelatory. I mean, even Luke 2, the very familiar Christmas narrative. I grew up with the King James Version because we didn't know there were any other versions. And I tend to find myself sort of retranslating any scriptural text back into King James, and especially Luke 2. And the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid.
Yeah.
Well, you have fear working itself out in the Christmas narrative, both with the shepherds and with Herod. He's afraid when he hears the word from the Magi that a son of the house of David has been born, and that fear then expresses itself in this violence.
Yeah.
The shepherds, on the other hand, also experience fear, but then it's followed up with "Fear not, for I bring you good tidings of great joy." I mean, that seems to be a pattern that happens throughout Scripture, is that God allows us to experience the fear, and in the fear to find the revelation. You sink beneath the water until you cry out, and you're pulled back up. I think that's a pattern that God repeats, not just throughout Scripture, but throughout all of our lives. And that's one of the reasons why I think when one looks back over life and says, where are the turning point moments where I really came to a new understanding or experience of God or of my calling, or what, they're usually in very scary, perilous times.
Yeah.
They're usually not in moments that feel like triumph to us.
Mm-hmm. And that's almost by definition.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that moment of that inflection point means I'm whatever I was used to, I'm not doing anymore.
Right.
Yeah. That's great. Relevance. We've mentioned relevance more than once already, and that's a place I want to dig in for a little while, because it's. What do you mean when you speak of relevance? How do you define that term, or the desire for relevance? What is it that we're desiring when we desire relevance?
I think what we desire is to be a central character in the plot line around us, and to ensure that that's the case. And I think that what happens in the way of holiness is a decentering of that. So what strikes me is that what I would expect when I came back to 1 Kings 19 and to Elijah on the run with new eyes is the fact that the story didn't resolve the way I would have wanted it to. which is with God saying to Elijah, yes, you're in the right. Here is what I'm going to do. He doesn't say any of that. He tells Elijah about how his own purposes are going to come about, but he talks about it in terms of other people. Elisha, Hazael, other people.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't even tell Elijah where his own story is going. And as a matter of fact, his own story becomes really mysterious. He's just suddenly gone in a whirlwind and doesn't show up again, except in hints and guesses, until the transfiguration. And so I think there's a sense of wanting to make sure that I am central to whatever little plot of ground I have, in a way that causes us to become frantic about it. It's one of the things I see a lot of times. I will have there'll be a younger minister who will say, "Oh, great situation! I've been called onto the staff of this church. The pastor there is going to be retiring sometime within the next few years, and I'm going to serve alongside him as co-pastor until he decides to retire, and then I'm going to be the senior pastor." There are maybe 2 times where I've seen that go well. Every other time it's been a disaster. And why? It's not because the older minister is exceptionally evil. He's not plotting anything. It's just that he sees his own mortality, and he can't see who he is apart from this particular place that he's been called to serve.
Yeah, man.
And so he starts to become fearful of that, and he wants to hold on to it and conserve it in a way that ultimately ends up being self-destructive and other destructive. And the more I've seen that, the more I realize that actually is going on with all of us all of the time.
Yeah.
And it's not just an end of life thing. It's an always thing in every one of our lives. I want to, and it's also in terms of, I remember one of the most liberating conversations I ever had was with this older man, and I was working through a situation in my life where I felt like I had made the wrong decision. It wasn't a big issue, it wasn't a big life or death issue, but it was just, I thought I'd made the wrong decision. And I just kept going back and looking at that decision and saying, what if I'd done the other thing instead of this? And what he said to me was, he said, your problem is you have a really narrative view of your life and of the world, and that's okay. But the problem is you think that you need to resolve the plot line, and you're never necessarily going to be able to do that. And so what you have to do is to make peace with the fact that you may not see this plot line resolved.
Yeah.
That there's a bigger plot going on that you don't have access to. And that I walked away from that. It was one of those, there are very few moments in your life where you walk away and say, what he just said has changed my life. But that was one of them, because I realized that actually is something that's going on all the time. I want to make sure that I know that the plot lines are resolved because I'm a Christian theist, but I want to be able to see how they're resolved, and to have control over that, which is a form of idolatry. Yeah, and that had to be taken away from me.
That's great. I remember reading something. This was actually from some 17th century writer who was talking about when you are upset at that you've decided that the world is gone to hell in a handbasket and it's never going to recover. You are like a person storming out at Act 4 of a comedy.
Yeah,
saying, this is such a wreck,
right?
And I hate this. I hate this play, and I'm leaving. Yeah. And or the person who storms out just before the last commercial, or just for the next last commercial of a sitcom.
Yeah. Well, and
that's the way a comedy works. Is it's a mess, and then it resolves at the end.
Right. And it's also, I mean, to go back to writing, I think a lot about Seth Godin, whose work I read. I read just about everything that he does, and yeah, he's fantastic. And he talks about walking into a coffee shop in Los Angeles, where you can find screenwriters all over the place who are there on their laptops and they're working on their screenplays. But he says, if you go up and say, okay, send it to me, let me look at it, or let me send it to someone else, how many of them will say no?
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because they actually would rather fail while telling themselves, I've written a magnificent screenplay that the rest of the world just doesn't know about, than they would to actually put that out into the world and be told, this isn't good.
Yeah.
Or we don't like this. And I think there's something of that pull, not necessarily with what we're writing, but with all sorts of things that we do, where there's this sense of, I want to make sure before I exercise whatever my gifts are, I want to make sure that it is received the way I want it to be received. And I want to make sure I'm in control of all of those things. And that's just not the way that that life or art work.
Yeah. So I'm trying to decide if this is, have we moved away from relevance? There's the pull on the one hand, the desire to get one's work out there is one way to feel relevant.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there is, if I don't feel, if it doesn't do what the fear of it not doing for me what I want it to do for me keeps me from putting it out there.
Yeah.
At all.
Well, I think
in either case, it's revolves around the idea that my work is going to do something for me. Right?
Yeah, well, not necessarily. I think it can also be, even with people who are other directed, there can be a misreading of audience in a way where one assumes that the audience that matters is whatever audience I can see right now. And so what God is saying to Elijah is, there are 7,000 people I've left for myself a remnant. It's none of your business who they are. Just do what it is I've told you to do. And, I thought about this a lot when Willie Nelson was, I was reading.
Now we're getting somewhere.
What's that? Yeah. I was reading an account not long ago about Willie Nelson when he was in Nashville and about how miserable he was trying to live up to the Nashville musical establishment. And someone, it was in Ken Burns' country music documentary, maybe Chris Christopherson or Waylon Jennings, I can't remember who said this, but said all the while that Willie was in Nashville, he was sort of writing these messages in a bottle that he was just sending out, not knowing that they were ever being picked up. And it wasn't until he got to Texas that he realized that all those messages were being received.
Wow.
And his people were out there, and he never would have been able to speak to them if he had simply decided to sound just like Jim Reeves or to do whatever it is that was expected of him. And I think that's true, really, for almost everyone. There's a way that you can sacrifice a future audience or an invisible audience for the audience of people that are right in front of you at the moment that scare you. And so I think of I went to a retirement party for a pastor I respect who had been fired from 2 really prestigious churches in his life, felt like a complete failure, and went and planted a church where he became this sort of fatherly figure to people who wouldn't fit in sort of typical evangelical circles that he had always served before. And it was just striking to see he never would have been able to minister to these people or they to him if his life had gone the way that he wanted it to go, or if he had simply adjusted himself to whatever audiences he was afraid of at the time. I think that's true for all of us in ways that we often can't see.
Yeah, no, I love that insight that, the difference between the audience that we see in front of us, we know as our audience, and I don't know what's the other, if that's the one side, I guess maybe our true audience or our whatever the other category is. I think it's really helpful to think about.
Well, and I think if you think about Peter Berger wrote in the sociologist in Noise of Solemn Assemblies back during the Jim Crow era about how why is it that all of these churches adjusted themselves to Jim Crow, either through active support of it or through silence. Mm-hmm. And he was talking not particularly about the lay people at that point, but about the clergy, mm-hmm. who often knew better in terms of what Scripture teaches and so forth. And he said the way that it works is not that you had people who were deciding to violate their consciences. It was that they were adjusting their consciences ahead of time because of the audience that was in front of them. And often with these little bargains that they would make to themselves. Well, if I speak to this, it's only going to cause a conflagration and I'll be fired and then I'll be replaced with somebody who's a lot worse on the segregation issue. So I'm going to bide my time and conserve my influence in such a way that those people who thought that they were conserving their influence for later on never had it. Wow. They couldn't speak to the people who were coming down the line because those people had watched them and had said, do you really have news? Are you really being shaped and formed by something transcendent, or are you finding protection in the herd that surrounds you, which is a really social Darwinian view of the universe that one can find anywhere. Yeah. And so it ends up the very thing that you're trying to, as Jesus says, if you try to save your life, if you want to save your life, lose it. And if you try to save your life, you will lose it. I mean, that's exactly what happens with all of these ways that we try to become what our audience wants us to be. And to go back to Seth Godin, he talks about this in terms of the way that what people want to do is to say, let me find what the world out there wants and adjust to that. Well, that's already there. You don't need that. At least what they actually need is the way that God has uniquely gifted you, which means that often you're going to receive people who don't get what you're doing or who don't initially like what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And everybody that you know who's ultimately made a difference in whatever arena have always been people who have persevered through people who were saying, you're doing this wrong, or you shouldn't be saying this, or you shouldn't be doing that. And I think that's true. Yeah.
Wow. That's great. I love this idea that you're the danger of preserving your influence by accommodating to your audience, that it just doesn't work. And I would have never, I don't know. Let's just say I have never made the connection between that and the idea of losing your life to save it. That's really helpful. I shall put that in my pipe and smoke it. Right? So you you're very productive. You write a lot of articles and books and podcasts and stuff. What are the disciplines and liturgies that make it possible for you to keep producing? Of course, you've implied that at the moment you're not producing something feel like you need to be producing.
Yeah, it's difficult for me because what I find is that, and this is not anything that I commend to anybody else, because I know that the way that I do it is not the way that I should do it, much less anyone else. But something almost has to incubate in me for a long period of time. And it has to be, I have to be sort of mulling something while I don't think I'm mulling it. So I have to almost trick myself into that before I can actually produce. But one of the things that I've had to do is I work best when I have an unfixable, unchangeable deadline in front of me, and not a trick deadline. So I can't fool myself with, well, you have to have it. So, for instance, one of the things I did, and the reason I did it, I started a newsletter because often I would have all sorts of things that I would want to write about that I'm going to write about that later on. Yeah. And then I would make a file about it. And then, I would notice it 5 years later that it's still there. So I said, I'm going to do a weekly newsletter where I'm just going to write about whatever I want to write about every single week. And that was really helpful to me. I was sick this past week with just some non-serious thing. And I thought, I don't really have anything to say this week. I'm just going to skip it. But I said, I'm not going to do that, because if I do, then I'm going to create a precedent for myself where I can say, well, you can always skip it. So just having that every single Monday, this is going out, has turned out to be, the structure of it has turned out to be really freeing for me in getting around procrastination.
How long have you been doing that now?
Well, we're on issue 17, so 17 weeks. Yeah. And frankly, the pandemic, and I say this without, I have to always qualify this, the pandemic is awful and horrible, but for me, not the pandemic, but the quarantine aspect of it was life-giving and enabled me to, in many ways, get my life back.
Yeah. I've found in the quarantine era, just being so present with what's going on in my yard. The birds I've got 15 caterpillars on my desk right now because I found them on my dill plant and realized they're going to turn into swallowtail butterflies. And I wouldn't have noticed that, this time last year.
Right.
And the newsletter, I found the newsletter, I've got a newsletter too. And that's just been transformative for me to have people who are expecting something from me. And that's another Seth Godin principle, is expected. Your people are expecting some communication from you.
That's exactly right.
And people who aren't giving me money. I mean, when I'm writing something that, when someone's paying me to write something, I always miss those deadlines because I usually have enough money at that moment. And then when I run out of money, then I do it. Yep. But when it feels something more like friendship, there are people who expect things from me the way friends expect things from each other.
Yeah.
That's really made a difference for me. I've never done any writing consistently. And I'm now up to about 130 weeks in a row that I've written this letter. I've never hit 10 weeks in a row at anything before this letter.
And it enables a kind of, it's different from, it's almost the inverse of social media, where what I find with social media is I started off, in say 2008, on Twitter.
Yeah.
And the people who at that time followed me on Twitter were people who knew me in one sense. And so they knew what it was that they were expecting. Mm-hmm. So I could make an offhand comment that didn't need a bunch of qualification. And then as time goes on, you start to realize, oh, wait, if you are, I remember when this started to turn was when I was with a friend who is well known as a kind of ascetic, simple life sort of person. And I said, joking, driving around in his new Bentley, which of course, anybody who knew him and knew me would know I'm making fun of him. But you had all of these, that is such hypocrisy that he would have a Bentley. It's like, okay, wait, this medium isn't working for me anymore. Yeah. But the newsletter format, you actually are able to start to learn to know based on the responses that come in who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And they're people who sign up for who it is that you are and the sorts of interests that you have. And I just think it works better in a way I probably wouldn't have predicted just a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the newsletter format and I post a little bit on Facebook and that kind of stuff, but not really. It's the newsletter is kind of I feel like that's my place to reach the world, to be relevant.
Yeah. Well, and the other part of it too is what I tricked myself into is to say to myself, to say to the readers, this is all a first draft. I'm writing this newsletter and I'm just inviting you in to think along with me, but nothing here is final. We're sort of showing our work, but we're grappling with things, which is necessary for me because what I found is I learned from, morning pages idea. What was helpful to me about that was writing a sort of, for lack of a better word, journal, but not being able to go back and look at it.
So you write the morning pages and then discard the morning pages?
Discard them, yeah. And
is that one of the rules of morning pages?
Well, you don't necessarily have to discard them, but you don't go back and look at them, and you don't have them for anybody else. Yeah. And because I'll go back and I'll look at old. I used to keep a journal, early on. I'll go back and look at that. The parts of it that are useful are the most banal parts. Yes. This day is the day that we, whatever. But all of the sort of interpretation or my reflections on my feelings, I can read that and say, you are posing because you're writing this for your future self to see or for somebody else to see. And so you're constructing it around all of those expectations. Yeah. And so I had to say, I've got to find a way to write this stuff where my future self will never see it and no one else will ever see it. Yeah. And so for the newsletter, what I've sort of done is to say to people, this isn't my statement on whatever. This isn't going to be necessarily talking about anything that's going on right now in the world. This is just going to be, hey, here I am and here are some things I'm thinking about it. What do you think?
How do you communicate that idea that this is just a first draft? Like in your welcome email, you mean? Or
I did in the welcome email, and then just in sort of the way that sometimes the way that I'll put it is to say, I'm not sure what I think about this yet, but here are sort of the ways that I'm processing it. Or even a lot of what I do is to take questions from people and to give myself the freedom to say, I don't know the answer to your question. So, for instance, we had this last week, someone wrote in and said that this person had a friend who was a deist now and wanted to know how to. And I said, here's one of the places where I was wrong. I used to make fun of that question when I would have students who would say, how will you respond to deism? And I would say, well, stop doing time travel. Because, once you get out of the 18th century, there aren't any deists around him. There's no reason to be a deist now. But actually, I'm finding that question coming up more and more. So I just had to go through and say, I don't know, because it depends on whether the person you're talking to, which direction they're going. It might be that you're talking to somebody who's an atheist, agnostic, who's saying that just isn't working for me anymore, but they're scared to go any further. Or you might be talking to somebody who comes out of a religious background for whom God just doesn't feel personal. And those are two very different things. But to say, I don't know. But here are some of the things that I would just think that helps me to get away from the idea that what I'm saying here is the definitive word that I have for you on whatever.
Yeah. I mean, so when it comes to what you're talking about, I think in terms of drafts, like I always tell my students, stop waiting to start writing. Don't wait until you've got it figured out before you start writing. You've got to wade into it.
Exactly.
But you're taking that another step, right? I mean, because one of the ways I talk to students is, hey, nobody's going to see this. You can just kind of wait around and figure it out. And you know how it's page 4. You finally write something smart, and then you can reorganize around that.
Yeah.
But that takes a certain amount of courage to throw it out there.
Well, or to say, what I found myself doing often is to say, I'm going to save this. I'm going to save it until it's the exact right moment to say it, or until I am really confident that I am saying what I want to say about this. And this was a way to just sort of take that away from myself and say that's not. Because what I would do is I would never then get to that point.
Yeah.
But what I would find is if I'm, one of the big creative sparks for me is something I don't get to do anymore, and it's teaching Sunday school. Because as I'm teaching Sunday school, and I say, "What questions do you all have?" and then things come up, and I'm dialoguing with people about that and grappling with that. Well, what does what would this mean for me when I just found out that I was adopted? Someone said at one point, I just found out I was adopted, he said, and I found out that my mother was a drug-addicted prostitute who doesn't want to see me. Okay, well, working through that with that person, there's something there that actually applies to a lot of people in all sorts of ways. And so that's just better, at least for me, than saying, here is my viewpoint on fill in the blank.
I think it's really helpful to think in terms of, creativity or ideas as being a river and not a reservoir. It flows, it changes, it moves. The idea of saving up for the perfect time is kind of a reservoir mentality. That if I spend it now, it's going to be gone. When the truth is, when you spend it, something else comes behind it.
Right.
And there's always more where that came from.
Right.
And it multiplies rather than subtracts.
Yeah.
All right, we're running out of time. I got to ask you the last question I ask everybody. Who are the writers who make you want to write, Russell?
Frederick Buechner, Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov has been huge in my life. And one of those things
and making you want to write?
Yes.
You read that and say, I want to go.
Not that I want to go write that.
Yeah.
But it takes me somewhere that puts me in contact with something that's there. So I never read Brothers Karamazov and say, I want to write something like that at all. But it alters me in that way. Wendell Berry is one. Willie Morris, my fellow Mississippian, especially his interviews and things. I tend to do that. Walker Percy always does. There are other. There's a poet named a poet living now named David White, whose work meant a lot to me at a really dark time in life. I just happened upon it was an audio essay that he had done, and then I went back and looked at his work, and his stuff often makes me want to write.
I find poets really make me want to go write something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's never a poem, because I look at what they do and I think I can't really do what that guy or that woman just did, but I want to go do something.
Right.
Concerts do the same thing. Musical concerts. They don't make me want to be a musician, but they do make me want to, do my thing.
Yeah.
Well, Russell Moore, thank you so much for being on The Habit, and I hope we can get together in person one of these days, not on Zoom.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.